Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors at Coram Deo Church, and I'm here with my buddy, my pal, my partner in crime, Pastor Jon. What's up, Pastor Jon?
Hey, it's good. It's birthday weekend.
It is birthday weekend. I was going to say it was just your birthday.
It's my birthday yesterday, yeah. Had a good day. The fall weather is changing, and it's my time of the year.
Awesome.
So I'm doing well.
Do you want to share how old you are, or is that like not a B-Sides answer?
I did get a happy 21st birthday card from somebody, so
Jon, I can introduce you to something really exciting. It's called whiskey. Now that you're 21.
I've never heard of that before.
What is this whiskey?
That you speak of?
Well, this is our first B-Sides. Well, actually, we had a little bit of we had a break over summer, but not entirely, because we did do our baptism according to the Word B-side episode. So this is our first.
Did we really?
Episode
I don't even
since
remember
then.
that.
Yeah, I remember we did the baptism.
Was that for the lecture or for the? Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I do remember that now.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like an hour and 20 minute long.
Yes.
B-sides. You must have blocked it out.
I'm trying to forget it. No. That was fun. I remember that. That was really good.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, so we had to go through all the extra questions from the lecture night.
Yeah.
So now we're back at it. We're back in Exodus. We're looking at Exodus chapter 21.
Woo.
And I want to give a quick bio of myself of Exodus up to this point. So I taught through Exodus with the youth, and I got to Exodus 20, and then it was like it was at the end of a year, and I thought, okay, I got to really kind of think about how I'm going to teach Exodus 21 and onward. And it kind of like lived on the back shelf for a long time, and I never got back to it. So I'm actually really thrilled to see you pick up on Exodus 21, something that I mean, and I'm like a glutton for punishment when it comes to going after the hard text. I just looked at the passage and I thought, how do you teach on 37 verses where almost every verse is just a separate law? I mean, they're related, they're in chunks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I can tell you that we're two sermons into this portion of Exodus.
Yeah.
And I think that is the law. It's called the law of the covenant. This section, right?
Correct.
It's like after the 10 Commandments, they call this section the law of the covenant.
Yep.
And does it span 21 through 23? Is that how long the laws like of this section span?
So we're doing we're doing 23 this week, and then 24 is basically confirming the covenant, and then in 25 you're at the sanctuary.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you are it's 3 chapters of basically just strictly law.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. 3.5. Yeah.
So that is not, people aren't used to going through that.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I know.
And because of that, I'm not used to knowing how do you teach on this huge chunk of, like, there's a lot of various instructions, and at both so we've done 21 and 22, and at both services, people are the conversations I've had with people afterwards was just how refreshing maybe isn't the right word they use. It was something like, I've never heard anybody teach on that before. Like excited that they're this piece of scripture that is, I think, often avoided, and maybe similar in my own regard. Like, some people just want to avoid it because they don't want to talk about it, but also it might just be a question of how you do it, right? And so I've really appreciated the way you've approached it. I think you've done just a great job of, I guess, summarizing the big chunks and making it really bite-sized. So if you haven't listened to those sermons yet, I encourage you, because I honestly don't know. There's not a lot of places where you're going to hear a sermon on Exodus 21. Yeah. And you kind of want, like, it's also, you're walking away. It's very edifying, and it's very helpful in a lot of today's questions we are facing.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things that like contribute to that. I think there's kind of an overall, I think, general attitude that the Old Testament in general is less helpful than the New Testament.
Yeah.
And then within the New Testament, the least helpful parts are parts like these. So I think there's kind of just, people just kind of feel that way. And so you don't get a lot of, sermons on it. Then I think you've got people who feel like, no, it is important, but this is just a bunch. It literally is laws. You're reading like a legal code, and struggling to know how do you take, 30 some verses of legal code and then turn that into a sermon that isn't like a book report. But on the flip side, right now we're living in a very dark and confused time. Right. It was like yesterday, it was like there was another assassination attempt on, a presidential candidate. And whether that was a second attempt against the Democratic or Republican, it doesn't matter. It's like, this is just a dark time. And so
it's a time of lawlessness.
It's a time of lawlessness and confusion. And so I think that reading Exodus 21 and 22 and 23 is actually super, like you said, refreshing, not in the sense that a gin and tonic is refreshing, right?
Exactly.
But in the sense of like, it's refreshing that there's like a clear truth. There's a clear standard that evil is actually named and called out and the good is commended, because we live in a day where the line between that it's not even blurry. It just doesn't exist. And so I think it's refreshing in that sense, to just be like, oh no, there is truth and there is evil and there is good and these things matter. And like I said in the sermon yesterday on chapter 22, I think one of the things that we want, pastorally for the church is for the church to hear these laws and go, man, wouldn't it be great if these laws, or the general equity, to use Westminster language, the principles of these laws were actually reflected and implemented in the laws that govern us, because these are, these are good, they're good laws. And I think that's the other thing that it leads to people not paying attention to these sections, is that I think people get embarrassed by the laws. And
they do.
They don't actually believe or have a hard time understanding how these are good and pure and true. But when you enter into the text with that like theological commitment and assumption that God's words are good and they're true and they're pure, and the psalmist says that the person who meditates on this is the one that flourishes, right? It's like then you're like, okay, these are actually life-giving words that we really desperately need to hear and understand and receive and implement to the best of our ability.
Yeah, there's a what you just said reminded me of Psalm 19. Like Psalm 19 has this beautiful section that talks about the heavens declaring the glory of God, and then it talks about nature and all these ways that it testifies to God's glory, and then it has this long section praising God's law. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. And on it goes. And I think that it might be a good practice when you're reading something like this in Exodus 21 to go read Psalm 19, read those sections on the law, and ask, Lord, help me to read this passage seeing what this guy saw. Right? Because the truth is, you're absolutely right. Like that posture of, it's God's word, thus it's the best. We should, and yes, there are certain things that sound foreign to us because we don't live in an agricultural and at times nomadic culture. Right. But the principles are the same. They are the same. So I think it might be good to talk about some of those principles. And also one of the principles that might be good to talk about is the three uses of the law. I think that Christians also tend to get trapped in just a strict law gospel dichotomy, where law is just, all it does is reveal sin. And then thus to be free from the law, as Paul talks about, is the only way we think about the law, whereas to be free from the law is not exactly what like normal today Christians what Paul means by it is not what a lot of Christians today think about it.
Yeah.
So then I think that the traditional Reformed view of thinking about that is helpful in talking about three uses of the law, right? And the first one is what like Exodus 21 is all about, which is, to actually, I think the first one is to reveal sin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the first one is to reveal. So all sin, all laws reveal to us, hey, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie.
Yeah.
Like, I realize I'm a sinner because these things expose in me that I am those things. Thus, I'm a sinner, condemned under the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the second use of the law is to restrain evil, and it's God's mechanism of common grace to protect a society, protect a people from dangers. And that law includes not just the prohibitions, but also the mechanism by which there are sanctions placed upon public evil, civil evil.
Yeah.
And before I move on to the third use, I'd love to ask you to unpack, and we talked about this beforehand, but unpack the difference between crimes and sins.
Yeah.
Because I think that's important as we look at some of these civil laws.
Yeah. So all crime would also fall under the category of sin because it's a violation of God's law, but all sin does not fall under the category of crime. So generally speaking, a crime is a sin that transgresses my neighbor's rights or his properties. It does a real actual harm against my neighbor. Sin would be a transgression against God and his law that doesn't necessarily harm my neighbor. So, for example, adultery is a crime that can be punished by death under the old covenant, but lust is not a crime, but it is a sin, right? Lust is not directly, in a tangible, real way, taking something from my neighbor. It's something that's happening in my head and my heart, and it is a violation of God's law. But it's another example would be greed, right? So I can't steal from my neighbor. That's a crime. But greed and the desire to have what my neighbor has is not a crime. That's a sin.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I tried to establish, and I don't think I did a very good job yesterday, but it's like the law is meant to address, like legal code is meant to address actual actions, not potential actions or thought crimes, but actual things that are committed. That's what the legal code is going after. So that distinction would be crime actually violates my neighbor's rights or his property, and sin does not, but still violates God's law.
Yes, that's so important, because if we get those two things, if we combine those two things, then you have a lot of Christians who are concerned about, Christian law, meaning all of a sudden we are, legislate, like it's like a thought police thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but there's, the point of law is to restrain evil. It's to sanction those things that need to be sanctioned in the public life to protect.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So, and then the third use of the law, just because I think that this is kind of addresses what we're talking about with Psalm 19, is that the law reveals to us what is pleasing to God, and thus for the Christian who's no longer under sin, right? No longer just the law is just a fearful thing for him, like a legal ghost haunting him, right?
Yeah.
For that Christian who's no longer that, now he can look at God's law and say, I'm thankful for God's law because it restrains evil, and also I want to obey God's law because it pleases him.
Right.
So and the heart that does that says I want to obey God because it pleases him, that is a heart that has been changed by the gospel.
Yeah.
Right? The legal heart goes, oh, I need to do this in order to put God in my debt or to earn my favor with him, right? And that's violating one of the purposes of the law. So I think I always find that three uses super helpful when we come to these passages, because a lot of people think that, okay, if we're looking at law, we're necessarily like avoiding, like not talking about the gospel. And it's like, no, like the gospel changes your heart. So you want to do what's good.
Yeah. I brought it up in that first, in chapter 21, where you have the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth standard of justice that is established, which means the punishment needs to fit the crime. And
yes,
a lot, you and I have both dealt with individuals who will quote Jesus from Matthew's gospel, where he says, "You have heard eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but I tell you, to turn the cheek." And people will use that to kind of cast Jesus in this antinomian, the law and the ethical standards of morality don't count anymore under the new covenant. And that's not what he's doing at all. Jesus is he's correcting people who would take the legal code and treat it as a relational code. So it is the duty of the magistrates to punish criminals. So if somebody, let's say somebody, I think I gave like a hypothetical, somebody killed your friend, and it would be absolutely just for the magistrates to take the life of that person, life for life. And the right thing for you to do as the friend is to forgive the murderer. The legal code, which says eye for eye, doesn't then justify you harboring bitterness and hatred towards the person. It's your job to turn the cheek and to forgive. You don't get to take the moral code and use that as justification for meting out justice on that individual in your heart. And I think that the criminal and the sin thing, people will conflate it and then throw it all out rather than understanding the distinction, and which is I think the real critique Jesus is making there.
Yeah, that what you just said there is so helpful and so important. Do you think that do you think that Jesus is addressing like I think that the Jews at this time didn't have the ability to mete out that capital punishment. And so what it's like, almost like, what were they left with but to have it in their hearts, like getting all nasty.
Yeah.
Do you think that Jesus is
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, do you think Jesus is addressing that, like almost like because they couldn't do it, they were doing it in their hearts?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, they didn't have the power to make their living under Roman captivity and rule, and when you don't have the ability for justice to be carried out, you want to harbor it in your heart. But I think there's also like the heart that is like unwilling to submit to Christ, to submit to the gospel, you'll find ways to justify violating the law, right? And so I think you could look back and go, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, therefore, right, I just wish ill for my enemies. That's justice.
Yep.
And no, that's a perversion of justice. That's not what you're called to.
That's good. It's really good. So there's kind of three big themes you talked about in the sermon. We've kind of touched on some of them, but maybe you could unpack a little further. The first theme was I'm not doing in the order you did them, but the first theme was
bracing myself.
Was restitution. I want to talk about, like, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Can you kind of unpack that concept of restitution and how it maybe plays out in other areas than eyes and teeth?
I'm not sure I know what you're going after, but one of the interesting thing that stands out, which I did talk about at length, was we don't actually do restitution in our culture. We do imprisonment. Yep. And when there is a fine, the fine goes to the state, not to the affected party or the victim. So when you read through Exodus 21, Exodus 22, Exodus 23, you do find restitution repeated over and over and over again. So if you harmed your neighbor's property, you were at least responsible to return it plus double. Yeah. And if the property was harmed or damaged, or then there's a fine. You are financially responsible to pay a fine for that. So you don't have imprisonment and you don't have fines going to the magistrates, but you have the situation being made right specifically between the guilty party and the victim. There's not a third party that's interjected in there that's now benefiting economically from these violations of law.
Yeah, I think I guess what I probably inappropriately used the word restitution when I meant justice. So like the idea that the crime fits.
Oh
The penalty fits the crime, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And you just hit something that I think is a really like an example where we don't do this. A lot of our justice system stuff like doesn't like things can be like, for instance, like let's just take for example the person who I think back it used to be a law that if you were caught with marijuana on you 3 times, right?
Yeah.
There's some states that had 3 strike laws where you could go to prison for life for something like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's an example of, okay, does that fit the crime though?
Yeah.
Like, does that penalty fit the crime?
Yeah.
And I think that what we see is, and you I think talked about this, is how much more just the Bible is in these areas.
Yeah.
And you just said it, like the justice system seems to be building a system where they kind of benefit from these longer term sentences.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I didn't know that until I started doing some research on it, but incarceration is incentivized, and the longer you're incarcerated, the more incentive there is, which really isn't about just, and it's not really about the rights of the victim. In our system, the victim, if you were to step back and go, okay, where is the payment going to, or the sentences, what is kind of demonstrated as the real victim in crime? And it's almost as if the state is the real victim. Like everything's done against the state, and the person who actually suffers isn't really part of the equation, which is exactly the opposite in Exodus. But I think to kind of piggyback on, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the penalty must be of the same gravitas and the significance and weightiness as the crime. That's true, but there are certain crimes that you read in Exodus 21 that sound super wonky because we undervalue justice, not the other way around. So, for example, in verse 17, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death.
Yeah.
And you hear that and go, is that eye for eye, tooth for tooth? And it's like, yes, that is eye for eye. That is tooth for tooth. Now, I don't know if you've researched that verse and what's going on there, but there are certain verses like that where the legal code allows up to capital punishment. However, you don't have cases of that necessarily being carried out, which, if nothing else, a verse like that tells us how terrible it is to curse your parents. Right. Yeah. Even if that was never enforced legally with a death penalty, it's telling us something about the nature of that offense. Yep. And so when people like to say, I remember I spoke at a local college group once, and we were talking about sexual sins, and I was kind of playing the card of, all sins are equal, right? Because that's something you hear. Well, sin is sin is sin is sin. It's like, well, all sins, make you an object of wrath. They all bring condemnation, but not all sins are equally destructive to an individual or to a society. And the Old Testament law gives us the ways and measures to see that some of these things, like some sins, like stealing your neighbor's, cattle or your sheep, can be addressed by paying double back or 4 times back, right? That's fairly simple. And then there's some sins that are only punishable by death. And that tells us that the wrong done to an individual or a society by those specific sins is uniquely and objectively more harmful than the crimes that can be addressed simply by restitution.
Exactly. You can pay back a fine, and I think double for stealing. If you steal someone's cattle, right? You're losing what you gained and what you hoped to gain on top of that.
Yes.
So it's doubled up.
Yep.
And then, but if you steal your neighbor, you're put to death.
You're put to death.
Man stealing.
Yep.
Yeah. Which and we can I think we can get that. Like, we can understand that there's that's if people kidnapping people like on a regular basis. Like, you need to nip that in the bud.
Yeah.
Right. You need to not let that have any possibility of being tolerated. And I think that, to your point, we often just don't realize how destructive some of the things we do tolerate are for a people.
Right.
And in my mind, there's some vestiges of this that are not completely gone, maybe close to gone. Like, so for instance, cursing your mother and father, for some reason, it reminds me of like treason. Like in this particular, you're talking about your mother and father in that particular context. It would have been like the people who were ahead of your, like, it's kind of like, especially in the earlier stages of the Hebrew life, there wasn't as many magistrates. Your father and mother were kind of functioning in that role more back then. And so, but we get that, like, because I think death is still an option on the books for treason in our country.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? And so it's this it sounds harsh to us, but in the same way, we kind of know how this works already.
Yes, but it also, what you just said is really, and this is not like, the main thing that we're supposed to talk about, but I think it indicates the idolatry of the state.
Absolutely.
That treason against your parents is no big deal, but treason against the state, you die. What does that?
That's true.
What does that say about order?
Yeah.
Right? It does say something about it.
Yep. Does. Okay. We got.
You gonna go there?
5 or so minutes to talk about slavery.
Yep.
So you got the big passage on slavery on Exodus 21.
Yeah.
There's obviously, it's a complex issue with tons of weeds and shrubbery to have to weave through to because of how volatile of a topic it is in our culture. It's almost like people want it to remain volatile because it's helpful for some people today for it to remain volatile. But maybe you could give us a brief, what are some important principles to understand about why slavery is permitted in the Bible?
Yeah. So if you're watching this B-sides and didn't listen to the sermon, I think it'd be really helpful to go back and listen to the sermon, because I spend most of the sermon talking about, I think it's like 25 minutes talking about that issue. So we don't have 25 minutes now to talk about the issue. But I think that your question was, what was the question again?
Basic principles for understanding why slavery is permitted in the Bible, what it is. How do we think about that?
Okay, so one of the things that you need to be aware of is that just using the word slave, that word gets attached to our country's history. And so we have a tendency, and a very understandable tendency, to kind of import slavery in our history, which was race-based and, not good.
Based on man stealing.
Based on man stealing, for sure. Which, by the way, in Exodus 21 is punishable by death.
Yep.
So one of the things is, like, read the whole chapter. Don't just read one verse. Like,
yep.
So you have to avoid kind of importing our history into this text. So you got to separate those as much as you possibly can. The other thing is, like, you have to read the whole text. So, for example, in verse 16, the verse that you just referred to, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So whatever slavery is being talked about in Exodus 21, it's not that, because that is condemned and is punishable by death. So understanding the context is always hugely important. There's a song in The Sound of Music. I think it's one of the songs. How do you solve a problem like Maria? Right? Do you know that song? Are you familiar with The Sound of Music?
I'm not recalling it right now.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's from that musical. Anyways, slavery was meant to be Hebrew slavery in Exodus 21 was meant to be a merciful response to a very broken reality and situation. So this isn't dreamed up, oh, how can we make more money and oppress people? That's not what's happening here. There's a very real situation, and they seem to be anticipated. I think it's in in Deuteronomy 15, where you either have people who are in financial ruin, right? They're just completely broke. There's no way forward. They have a massive debt that they cannot pay, or you have people who are in trouble because of criminal activity, which, because of restitution, would create the economic situation. And so the question is, what do you do with the person who has dug themselves, not somebody who's a victim to injustice, or this is somebody who has dug themselves a deep, 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 deep hole that they cannot get out of due to criminal activity, poor decisions, mishandling of finances. What do you do with that person? How do you help them get forward and set them up for the best possible scenario for success? Slavery is the answer to that problem that's meant to solve that situation. And what slavery did is that, one, so people weren't like sold on an open air market into slavery by some slave trader. An individual would sell themselves into slavery. They would negotiate the terms with the master, and the master would then take 100% responsibility for the economic debt or the burden of the slave. So he is paying that out of his own pocket, and the slave then has to earn that back during the term of slavery, which was limited to 6 years. And there's some indication that 6 years may not have even been 6 years, but that on the 7th year of a cycle, the slaves would be set free, which would mean every 6 years, slaves go free. So if you sold yourself into slavery in the 4th year, and this is where Deuteronomy tells the owners, don't withhold things from them, and don't be bitter towards them, and don't say no to the deal, because they're only going to serve 2.5 years. Which, total side note, when Jesus talks about the servants who get hired later in the day, you get the same pay. I was like, oh, I wonder if that's part of what's going on here. Like, you get the same thing, but you're not working. I don't know if that's it, but it could be that it was just every 6-year cycle they were set free. So you may be a slave for 3 years. You may be a slave for 2 years. You would never be a slave for more than 6 years. So in that period of 6 years, you're learning a trade. You're part of a household. You're not, in some small concrete cell with a bunch of other criminals. You're working. You have your food provided. You have your basic necessities provided. You're part of a functional, healthy family unit in a household. You're surrounded by responsible men who can show you, how to be a responsible man. They can teach you a skill. They can teach you, piety and righteousness. You're around believers, right, who love the Lord, who are bound to love their enemies and their neighbors, and you're learning things along the way that you then, when you're free, are able to implement, so that you're not a burden to the state, you're not a burden to society, and you're not hopefully going to return back to that situation, because you've learned how to exercise self-control and express dominion and to be an independent person.
Yeah, it reminds me of the legal pathway, or the legal manifestation of a lot of the lessons of Proverbs, right? Like, Proverbs is all about like you must take in this wisdom, otherwise you will make a slave of yourself through your own greed, your own because greed makes you cut corners. Like, instead of being industrious, you become a thief, right? And or you do something, your laziness, right, can result in your poverty coming upon you like an armed man. And so if you're not taking wisdom in, and it's becoming, you're applying these things, you're aiming towards slavery, and then it becomes real slavery.
Yes.
And the whole point of that real slavery in the Hebrew the Hebrew understanding of Hebrew slaves is that this is where you now have forced tutelage. You're now being forced to learn this wisdom, and you must then apply it at the end of the time of Jubilee. Otherwise, you're going to be back here again, and you don't want to be back here again.
Absolutely.
So that's a very it's very contra. I think that. What do you think? I think that there's a bit of a historical allergic reaction to the concept of slavery because of our history, but I think there's also. I'm curious for your thoughts on this. There's also a kind of like the idea of not belonging to myself and being the captain of my destiny at all times. Is abhorrent to our culture, so long as you're not in the military, because everybody has to do it to do that. Right. But do you think there's something behind there that the Bible's also correcting here?
Yeah. I think there's, James Jordan talks about the anti-dominical tendencies of lazy men, and I think the person who is lazy and irresponsible and is in trouble is the person who doesn't want to answer to anybody. And and I mean, it's almost counterintuitive. Like it's really hard to wrap your head around it. But I've talked to, I would say almost every person that's homeless that I've ever talked to, right? About like I've offered to drive them to rehab. I've offered to connect them with resources. And almost to a T, every single person was like, "No, I like this." But you're outside, you're cold. It's Washington, it's wet. And it's like, well, I don't answer to anybody. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, and it just like makes you want to cry. Being like, but you're a slave, right? Like you're a slave because you don't want to answer to anybody. And I think God has created a world in which there is order, and there are leaders, and there is authority, and that structure is good for humanity. That's how we thrive. And when you reject that structure, right, you become a slave.
Yep, and it's paradoxically like self-defeating, because you want to be your own man, but then you become a slave, right? Yeah, and that's. Interestingly, there's another Proverbs link there. The whole entire book starts with listen to the advice of your father, heed the wisdom from your mother, right? And if you don't, you're going to end up like a slave.
You're going to be a slave, yeah.
Well, I had a spicy question for you, but maybe we'll have to talk about it later, because we are at 37 minutes, which is the end of an episode.
Alrighty.
So I'm okay talking about that one at a different time, maybe.
Sure.
All right, everybody, thanks a ton for joining us for Sermon B-Sides. Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See ya.
See ya.